We're going to get started with week one lecture now. And this is where we're going to cover a lot of some foundational concepts of sociology that are crucial because they are big picture, theoretical, and foundational, and they tie into the ways that we analyze our data. We are also going to talk a little bit about some philosophical foundations of research, as well as the different types of qualitative research designs that exist, and then which ones you're going to be focusing on. So when we talk into sociology, you probably hear a lot of times things like systemic and structure and institutional. And we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between them and why they're important. So when we talk about the structure, we're talking about the reality that, our relationships are and interconnectedness is between our different individuals and groups and structures and systems and institutions. And when we're having that conversation, we have to really be able to hone in and narrow down into what structure actually is. So, structure is essentially the patterned arrangements in our society. What this is the things like our policies, our laws, our norms, our rules. They serve some sort of function to guide our everyday lives. And they oftentimes impact the types of cultural norms that are in place. There's different types of cultural norms that exist. You have folkways, which are the things that you should do. So, like that's something like raising your hand or lining up at a grocery store. You have your mores, which are things that are not officially informal, but they have severe consequences. So in some cultural groups, it could be like having premarital sex or having a tattoo. And then you have taboos, which are things with extreme disgust. They may or may not be something that is formal, but we have a strong reaction to it. So face tattoos historically in the United States were reacted to with a sense of extreme reaction. And substance abuse has been one, and and sorry, cannibalism is also another taboo. Fun fact, cannibalism is actually only illegal in two states. Anyway, and then you have laws, which are legal, formal on the books. Now, even just in these few examples I've provided, these cultural norms are dominant in the United States, but we also can see that there's like subcultures and different groups, and that norms are changed within different communities and societies. And I bring these up because the structure impacts what types of cultural norms are the norm and what is not, what is a taboo and what's not. So the structure is the larger functioning in society. And this is where we get the word systemic from, right? It's the larger systems in our society that essentially put together all the interrelated components. They incorporate some sort of process or procedure and impacts our daily lives. As sociologists, we cannot talk about structure but we actually can't talk about agency without talking about structure and how they're connected. You've probably heard the word agency, and a lot of that has to do with like your ability to make decisions, and that's true. It has a lot to do with the power and access to resources too. And what agency is essentially the individual experiences either as an individual human or an individual person or a group of people, an individual group, to be able to make choice, to make some sort of movement and choice within their own lives. And agency and structure are very closely related because agency is either empowered or disempowered by our systems and structures. And I want to make a note, though, that sometimes it can be really depressing to think about it that way. And while it is true, so for example, an individual's ability to be able to read, historically, there was an interconnection between race and literacy, not in terms of somebody's fault, but in terms of the policies and laws and who was allowed to learn and learn and be taught how to read. Or we can think about agency in terms of where people are allowed to live. So La Jolla, where our school is at, it was illegal for people of color to live there prior to the 1960s because, the conversation hadn't even gotten started until UCSD was being built. So an individual's choice to live in La Jolla was limited. Their agency to move there was limited based on the structure. So While that's true, it can be really depressing to see that. But it's important to note that while individuals' agency oftentimes is limited or encouraged by the structure, because that's where privilege comes in, right? We have to recognize that people have fought for their right to have more agency, and by not talking about that does a disservice to the movements and fights that people have done. um, and what that does though is that fighting for personal agency and group agency then allows for deep structural change too to take place, which we can be able to see. So agency and structure are very closely connected. Now they are also connected to institutions. So institutions are different, but they are a part of the larger structure. So they exist within the structure, and you can think of them as parts of a whole. So if you figure like a car, right, the institution is like the engine, or it's the wheel, or it's the catalytic converter, or it's, whatever it is. The institutions are different parts, but they make up the whole system. Institutions essentially are organizational, and they fulfill some sort of role to create some sort of organization and socialize us in a way and how we interact. It helps us provide some sort of sense making to our everyday lives, but it also provides social control and coordination. Some examples of institutions in our society are the institution of the family, education, military, government, and religion. So these are all examples of institutions. Excuse me. So that brings us to the sociological imagination. And one of the things that I really want you to develop in this class is a sociological imagination as it relates to your ability to interpret data and also even just come up with the research questions that you're curious about. Some of you will go on to grad school and many of you will not. And whatever field you're in, being able to use qualitative research connected to the sociological imagination will be incredibly helpful for you and beneficial, because you'll be able to collect data and analyze it and critically think and come up with genuine innovative solutions, and at the very least important questions that can move us forward. And so the sociological imagination is coined by C. Wright Mills in 1959. It's basically where he talks about how we can have our personal troubles or private troubles, which are often individual circumstances. These things can be like joblessness or marital strain, financial mobility or lack thereof, and those are personal troubles. Nobody's dismissing those, but oftentimes they're reflective of the larger social problems, something that's in larger context. So if somebody loses their job, that's a personal trouble. But if there aren't a lot of jobs available, that becomes a social problem, right? Marital strain or an individual experiencing some sort of domestic violence in the home is absolutely, a devastating personal struggle and issue. But we also know that in many places it's also a social problem. So what C. Wright Mills is doing is trying to explain how, like, yes, we have our personal troubles, but it's often in the context of larger social problems. It also is about how we're influenced. So one of my favorite quotes that he says in his book is that it's neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both, right? Yes, we are individuals. There's nobody that's denying that, but we cannot pretend that we don't exist within the context of history, right? Many people's existence is a very political act, a very historical act. And one of the things I'll talk a little bit about in my positionality is that despite my name, despite how I look, I am part Korean. And growing up, like my grandma was born and raised in Busan, Korea. And I think a lot about how my existence, right, is the result of US imperialism. It absolutely is, right? If my grandfather hadn't been in Korea during the Korean War and met my grandmother, who was born at, the tail end of kind of everything that was happening, and they wouldn't have met. So thinking about these realities, right? And I'm not saying that's like a negative thing, nor do I want us to go down any type of rabbit holes and feel bad about our existence. That's not what I'm saying. Just that I cannot pretend that my existence is not connected to some sort of history, right? Us being in this classroom, online or otherwise, is a part of history. COVID-19 learning and teaching was a part of history, right? And all of these acts are a part of an analytical approach of the sociological imagination. He also says it's where history meets biography. And so we cannot pretend that like our biographical stories are not connected to the larger historical aspects. And that doesn't mean that we don't have individual situations, but that we have to see how individual circumstances, that individual movie and its representation or lack thereof is reflective of a larger historical component, or, that schools, like charter schools and their existence. So there's a lot of factors that play into this sociological imagination. Now, I'm going to go over this. This is normally an exercise I do in my classes, and if you've taken a class with me, then you are familiar with this one. But I'm just going to go through and kind of talk about how we understand this and an example of using the sociological imagination. So, with this, I normally present on the screen 4 cups and these, and I ask very right off the bat, what is this, right? And people normally say it's coffee or it's Starbucks. And I ask, how do you know it's Starbucks? And they say, well, the logo, it's internationally recognized, right? And this is true. It is an internationally recognized logo. And my very first question after that is, what is that logo? And I'll pause, let you think for a minute. So if you said that logo was a mermaid, that is incorrect. The logo is actually a siren. So the siren, if you're unfamiliar with her in lore, is this beautiful, well, she sings a beautiful song and lures with the and presents beautifully at first to lure sailors to their deaths. And it's an interesting representation if you think about what the siren's role is and the way that coffee and caffeine and commercialism kind of allures you in, right? So that's kind of the very first part that we could start thinking about. How do we know it's coffee? Well, it's a typical type of coffee cup that we're socialized to understand as coffee. It's for hot drinks. It's these are it's likely holidays. We ask how, well, because it says Merry Coffee, right? Merry Coffee. Well, we know Merry is a part of Merry Christmas, which is the dominant Christian holiday in the United States. So we know that this has been socialized us to recognize these power dynamics, right, around religious kind of orientation and perspectives in the United States. Well, what else do we know about this? Well, we can also think about Starbucks as an international company and how they can go in and like wipe out small businesses. So that has economic implications. We also know that there's a lot of labor busting and labor union organizing taking place, which tells us that labor values and are not valued really by Starbucks, while also recognizing that people are being exploited. We also know that coffee represents some sort of energy, right? Coffee is caffeine and caffeine is for energy. So thinking about the sociological imagination, we go in and get our cup of coffee. We go through the drive-through because we're really tired. We get our cup of coffee because, we stayed up the night before, having to work a lot, having to, crank out that assignment, having to go to your job. And so you wake up, you get your cup of coffee for that energy boost, you pay the barista, off you go to work your job to make that boss a bunch of money so you can go to school, so that way you can have a decent life. And then you go home and you go to sleep and you wake up, you have a cup of coffee, rinse and repeat, right? And that may look like an individual struggle because you're really tired, but then you also have to think about the barista. So you paid that barista, the barista gave you your latte. The barista has health insurance, great, but they can't use it probably because they have to work so much themselves. They made minimum wage plus a few tips, which the tips are now the responsibility of the consumer, though. And yet, some big CEO made bank up there at Starbucks, not and that barista did not make what they just did, right? They did not make the actual labor that they had. Meanwhile, Starbucks is purchasing these beans from other countries, ravaging their resources, not actually paying them sustainable wages for their beans or sustainable pay for their beans, even though they're supposedly part of fair trade. But if you actually look at it and you do the math, it's really not a part of fair trade. And then that community now has fewer resources, and they're probably living in poverty because of US imperialism. And not necessarily that person, but because, different dynamics and such. And they don't have the resources. There was also like, just as an example, when quinoa was a huge thing a couple of years back, people were talking about how, yeah, sure, it was sustainable to some extent, but what was happening is that the people who actually were harvesting it were the ones who used that the most, and they now didn't have access to one of their prime harvest and food sources. So thinking about that, right? Going back to Starbucks, we're thinking about how these interconnections are crucial to recognize, and using the sociological imagination looks at that. And what that is reflective of is an economic structure that's rooted in exploitation of work and labor. And in turn, it becomes this vicious cycle. And meanwhile, what we can look at that picture is it's just a coffee cup, right? It's obviously for marketing purposes, but we have to think about the larger implications of that. Okay, so when we think about the sociological imagination and it informs our research, we have to talk about some philosophical foundations. Before I go into that, this lecture, because it is relatively long, I'm going to have two different code words. The very first code word is going to be butterfly. So the very first code word is butterfly. The second code word will come a little bit later. So again, that very first code word is butterfly. Okay, so when we going back now to research, we have to recognize that research has its origins in philosophical foundations and philosophy. Sorry, I'm going to go forward a little bit real fast. Okay, and I bring this up, it's not in here, but I bring this up because I'll probably revisit this a little bit in more detail, but the scientific method is something that we learn really young. Like my children are just finished grades 4 and 6, and they were learning the scientific method in grades 4, and that is basically where you come up with a problem and you come up with a hypothesis, and then you collect your data, and then you evaluate it, and then you readjust and stuff. And that's essentially what we do. And it was excuse me, utilize the scientific method. And science is rooted in philosophy, right? If you think about the Pythagorean theorem, that comes from a philosopher named Pythagoras. So we have to think about like philosophy and its role in informing research methods. And so there's a couple concepts that you're going to need to understand and kind of grasp, because this influences the types of questions that you ask as well. So the very first one is ontology. Ontology, or your ontological belief or ontological foundation, is essentially what we believe to be true. Ontology basically makes us think about what do we believe to be true and what is the purpose? What is our nature? Do we believe in truth big T or truth little t? And the reason, what I mean by that is that truth big T is that there's a universal truth. There's a singular truth or singular outcome that we're seeking, while truth little t is not. Truth little t is a truth that has to do with more, that there are multiple truths that can exist. An ontological belief in the truth big T is positivism. And with that, that tends to be rooted more in quantitative research. And truth little t is constructivism. Things are constructed. And that has to do with more of a qualitative approach. Now, I bring that up because epistemology has to do with how we learn that. So if your ontological belief is positivism, that's going to influence what epistemological approach you take. So ontology is what you believe. So that's positivism and constructivism. Epistemology is, now that I know what I believe, how do I find that out? How do we seek that truth, right? How do we understand more about that and what we believe? And this is what's found in our methodology. Now, your ontology is often found in both your research question and your theoretical framework, because you're explaining the social phenomenon of what you believe to be true. Meanwhile, epistemology is often found in your methodology, because this is how do we seek that truth? How do we find that out and learn more? So if your ontological belief or your ontology is positivism, your epistemological approach is going to be quantitative. If your ontological belief is truth little t, that's constructivism, your epistemology or epistemological approach is going to be qualitative. So we're in the qualitative class, and that means that when you write your research questions, your ontology is going to have to be rooted in a constructivist approach. And this comes up in the types of research questions that we develop. And I'm going to give you some more examples. I'm going to give you an example in a second, but I want to cover real fast what axiology is. Axiology has to do with morals. Like, what do we believe to be moralistic? What do we believe to be right and wrong? And how is this going to influence our research? Do we believe that participants should be mere participants, like in the sense that we just ask them questions and then we collect their data? Or do we believe that it should be a collaborative environment? So axiology is going to help influence and inform what types of research, morals, and ethics we engage in, beyond just kind of what the traditional ethics are. So going back to this, research questions, if your ontological belief, your question was more positivist, your research question might be something like, what are the graduation rates in San Diego high schools, right? And the reason why that's a truth be told is you're not looking for the whys or the whats. You're looking for just simply that outcome. What is that? What is the graduation rates? And that epistemology would be a quantitative approach because you're just doing some sort of quantitative data analysis, right? You're collecting quantitative data numbers and you're analyzing it. However, ontological belief of constructivism might influence a question to look more like what family factors play a role in in San Diego high school graduates' ability to graduate, or what family factors play a role in in San Diego high schoolers' beliefs around high school graduation. So you see that that's asking, like that's recognizing that things are can be very vast, different experiences are there. It's looking at the social construction of life, and that's more of a qualitative approach. So just this is just kind of a little bit of a breakdown of what I was just saying. Um, Ontology is what you believe. So there's a couple different types of ontology. This right here, this positivism, I'm just kind of showing you on like what the different beliefs are. So ontology is more about like objectivism, constructivism, basically like what do you believe, right? That's the theory and what you believe. While epistemology is now how you're going to interpret it, or how you're going to collect that data. Um, so this actually is supposed to be over here. I apologize, and this should be over here. So constructive, oh, sorry, these ideas here, positivism, constructivism, and objectivism, are kind of like those beliefs. And epistemology is like, how are you going to collect your data and what? Axiology is what is valuable and important. So that really does, the reason why that's under here is your research questions are basically what questions you're asking, but those are influenced by, right, what your ultimate overarching belief is. Meanwhile, methodology is the approach now. So let me go back a little bit. This is just kind of a general like groundwork so you understand the philosophical foundations, but now this is like step by step around the scientific process kind of on what influences what we do and the different elements or layers. Because in a methods paper, your methodology paper is a methodology paper, which you're going to include basically how does this lead to this, and influence your methodology. And the methods are the tools that are used. So your methodology is the approach that you take, qualitative or quantitative, and that's connected to your epistemology. Meanwhile, your methods are the tools that you use to collect that data. It's all very closely connected and intertwined, but at the heart of it, if you can remember that ontology is what you believe, epistemology is how you learn what you believe, right? So what do you believe about the world, truth or truth? Epistemology is how you learn about that. What type of methods are you going to take? And then what do you believe to be moral or important to research? Um, and this is important too because it ties into your positionality. You are expected to have a positionality in your methodology paper. And I do have positionality, I believe, listed for next week, but that's because you have like a little small reading to do with that. But with methodology, or sorry, with positionality, it's more than just simply a set of ideas, or identities. So our positionality is who we are and where we're positioned in the context of the larger social society. A lot of people can think about it as being a set of identities, and that's a starting point, right? Like I can list mom, I can list white and Korean, I can list teacher and educator, I can list writer. There's a lot of things I could list, and that's great, except I have to put that in the context of the broader social structure. So some starting questions that you could have to think about your positionality is this: what is your ontological stance? So to start foundationally, do you think it's big T, little t? What do you think? Then what do you believe your epistemological stance is? Then do you think that quantitative is the best approach to understanding more about the world, qualitative, etc.? Um, what is important research? What's valuable to you? How are you going to collect data? So these are some questions to start with. Then start thinking about, now with all of these, think about your own social location. And when I say social location, that means like, who are you? What is your disability status? What is your racial identity? What is your gender identity? And this is not to tease those out because we cannot pretend that they exist single-handedly, right, as singular identities, but those are important. How do we view the world? How do our cultural backgrounds and our social conditions influence what we understand about the world? What do we believe? And what do you think about what research is and what its role is? As I'd mentioned before, when I talk about research, a lot of people think about just numbers, but research is so much more than that. So these are some things for you to start thinking about as you unpack your positionality. Next week, I'm going to go through some my positionality and explain how that influenced some of my work in the past, so you can think about how to unpack your positionality. Okay, so we're going to go through the ethics of research. There's a decent amount of slides, but I'm not going to go through every single detail. Um, I think that you can get a good idea from this. There's also some readings that you really should read around the Tuskegee syphilis study and the tea room trade, and kind of contextualize why ethics are important. Now, ethics of research have to do with these principles that guide what is appropriate during research. It's important to note also that ethics and legality are not the same. So the tea room trade, when you go and read that one, it was legal. So it was not ethical what he did. It technically was legal what he did, but highly unethical. Um, so these are questions that we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about the research questions that we do, thinking about the context of education settings, because remember that we're in an education settings. This is not just a typical qualitative research class, but specifically qualitative research in education settings. So as you start thinking about your topics and you narrow in, you need to think about it in terms of education specifically. Okay, so some questions and thoughts as people are starting to design their research and ethics is that the benefits must outweigh the consequences and risks. That is first and foremost when it comes to ethics. The next is that a key element of ethical behavior in research is that people involved are introduced to informed consent. So Diener and Crandall say that these are the procedures in which individuals choose whether to participate in an investigation after being informed of facts that would likely influence their decisions. So I bring this up because you need to be able to understand and receive informed consent. I'm not asking for a signed contract. I'll get into it a little bit more, but when you do your interviews, for instance, you are going to want to ask them before you record if you have permission to record. And then when you start recording, you'll have to ask them if you have permission as well. They need to be informed of this. So what you have to do is you have to ask them if they're willing to, based off of the following things that I'm going to explore more in. But then you also need to be able to recognize a couple of things. And the first is that they have the right to not participate, right? So just because somebody signs up, they can say, I don't want to anymore, because they've been informed more about the facts of the study. Now, the facts that you need to include as a part of ethics of research is that you have to talk about what is the purpose of the study, right? If that's your research questions, yeah, but you need to be able to have your elevator pitch. Like, what are you trying to find out? You're also going to find out what the procedures are. I'm going to ask you a series of 30 questions, or 30, I'm going to ask you a series of 30 guided questions. This shouldn't take more than 45 minutes. Whatever that is, they have to know a general idea of the study. You have to state the statement of risks and benefits. So for example, if you're talking about acts of racism within the classroom, you're going to want to talk about the risks of, discomfort and triggering experiences. So you need to let them know what the risks and benefits are. There are no direct benefits to most people in these research projects. So there's always that right there. Um, then you have to tell them if there's compensation. The answer is likely no, that there is no compensation. In your case, there is not compensation, so you need to make sure you say that. You have to tell everybody who's involved with the research. So it's you, and in your research as well. It won't just be you, but it'll also be me. So you'll tell them that your professor is overseeing this research, and so the only people that'll have access to this is going to be myself or you and my professor. You have to ensure anonymity, so and confidentiality. So it's not really anonymity because they're not anonymous. Like who they are. A lot of people tend to throw around anonymity and confidentiality as the same thing, but they're not. Anonymity is essentially Anonymity is essentially, not having their identification. And even though you're taking their identification away, you still know who they are. Um, Additionally, you have to tell them that it's voluntary and they can stop at any point, and that you need to be willing to offer them a summary of the findings if they want to see what the findings were. Um, some background with the ethics of research. We have to know that research has been really shady. The United States Public Health Service, for example, had the Tuskegee Institute or the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. This was intended to be only a 6-month study. This was run by the United States government. What the Tuskegee syphilis study was is that basically had taken 600 Black men, 399 of them had syphilis, and 201 of them did not. What they basically did was they told them that they had bad blood. They did not receive any informed consent. It was supposed to be a 6-month study in 1932. It became a 40-year study instead, so it lasted for 40 years. There were several things that came up that were really problematic. So 1943, penicillin becomes widely available, but it was not offered to the participants. They were simply told they had bad blood. They were not offered treatment. Um, an investigation takes place based off of the study, and the study ends finally in 1972, and this influences the Research Participation Protection Act, or the National Research Act in 1974. This is just one example, and this is, we're not doing any study to this length, but it is why ethics are involved and why people are so critical of research, right? Understanding the ethics and lack of ethics in the past of research is also how we can help understand why people are very critical of different procedures and medical trials and procedures, especially for seeing something like this, right? And so it is our job to be ethical so that way we can, help try to progress scientific inquiry. Okay, so these are just some considerations here. You'll have access to the slides. You have to consider all of these things and include them when you're thinking about the ethics of research. Um, these are just some other examples. Milgram's obedience study, highly suggest that you look it up. Another example why we have to be questionable of ethics or pay attention. Now, ethics of research, when it comes to IRB, IRB stands for the Institutional Review Board. Every large institution that does research, so here at UCSD we have it, San Diego State has one, San Diego Community College has one, and basically what they're doing is they care about the welfare of human beings. Now you'll hear them call human beings human subjects, which is ironic, considering it's supposed to be about protection of human beings, but it is what it is. You'll hear me refer to them as participants, but nonetheless, the IRB reviews research and how it impacts the welfare of human participants. There's different types. There's exempt, expedited, and full. So, and also not regulatory activity. So exempt is basically, hey, yeah, you interact with people, but the risks are super chill and little and minimal. And so we're going to say that you don't need to have a full IRB review. We just know that you need to make sure you stick to your research study. Expedited is that there's risks, but we're going to have somebody look it over really quick and you get approval. Full is that a full board has to review. And more normally when you're dealing with minors, folks that are disabled, imprisoned, folks like that are normally some sort of full review board. And then not regulatory activity would be things like watching movies and analyzing them and things of that nature. Now, because we are not submitting to IRB, I need you to know that you cannot interview minors. I'm asking you that not to interview minors. If you want to interview or have a research study that has to do about some sort of experience in K through 12, email me. Let's set up an appointment. We can talk over Discord or something, because there's ways that we can frame it to where you still would interview an adult to get insight about childhood experiences. But it's important to note that because we are not submitting to IRB, that you know that you cannot interview children. There are a few exceptions to this rule, but very few. I would say if it's a family member, but you still would have to get parental consent, and I would require a whole step. So I would say to prevent that, just don't. Um, Sorry for this class discussion, just ignore that. But these are things I do want you to think about, is like, how can this influence the types of questions that you ask? Okay. So, a couple things as we move forward. Okay, so the rule of theory is, excuse me, to explain social patterns. Basically, it's a rigorous framework rooted in scientific inquiry and data collection, and it helps to explain social phenomenon. And what we do is we engage in the scientific method to basically come up with explanations for things, right? So the scientific method is where you define a problem, where you ask a question, you're coming up with a question. You come up with a hypothesis or use empirical research to make informed decisions about things. That's what a literature review is. You gather data, which is where your methodology section is, or where your gonna data collection is going to be. You analyze that data, which is where your findings section is going to be. So your methodology and your findings section, which is a part of your paper, and then you draw conclusions, and that's what a discussion section is, and what you're going to sort of do when you talk about literature and theory. Now, theory is where you start bringing those conclusions and like section numbers 4 and 5 together. You have findings, and then you say, hey, this is how the theory is going to explain these. We're trying to help explain, we're trying to help explain, um, sorry, we're trying to help explain larger social patterns and individual experiences within the structural patterns. We're trying to figure out social behavior on a collective level. Now, collective being individual, like smaller communities, smaller societies, or larger structure. And what we're trying to figure out is the way that these are all interconnected through that. So we use scientific method to either come up with theory or use theory to explain the findings within the data that we've collected. Theory explains social phenomenon in these patterns. We have our three main theories in sociology. We have structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And what we use is something called a theoretical framework. This is what influences our views, kind of go back to the idea of ontology and explains phenomenon. It can also be the framework in which we understand collective behavior and structural behavior. Now, let me note though that these three theories here, even though they exist, are not the only three theories that exist. Most theories that we use can be kind of situated and nested under each of these, but these are the three main major theories that exist in sociology. I'm going to get into those. Oh, I'm actually not going to get into those. Sorry, I apologize. I'm not going to get into them too much, um, but I do want to explain just briefly. Structural functionalism is the dominant lens in which we view the world. Structural functionalism is the idea that society functions. It exists, it functions. If it exists, it has a function and it's logical. Because functionalism is the dominant lens in which we as a society, not like us individually, view the world, it also is why we question things like protests and stuff. Because if it works, like if it exists, it has a function, right? So if prisons exist, they have a function. If school exists, it has a function. Even if poverty exists, it has a function. And poverty's existence from a functionalist perspective is that it motivates people to work hard. Conflict theory is that there is a constant conflict over resources. It's between those who have and those who do not. It's power struggle between those. Functionalism and conflict theory are macro level theories, and they can analyze the same thing with different outputs or different perspectives. And this is why unpacking our positionality is crucial. So functionalism, for instance, might analyze a power struggle between two people and say that that's normal because power is inherently distributed differently. And while conflict theory would look at that and say that's unfair and we need to distribute those more equally. Now, symbolic interactionism is a smaller scale, it's a micro level theory. It doesn't mean that we're not analyzing kind of larger functionings, but it means that we're not analyzing, we're recognizing the smaller scale interactions as important, the symbols that we interact with. And that is more about smaller scale learning and socialization, right? And so the example I normally use is like the middle finger. It means FU, right? And we know that that can elicit a strong anger reaction, which is real and physiological, but that's rooted in what we learn. Meanwhile, that isn't inherent or biological, and that's what symbolic interactionism looks at. Symbolic interactionism looks at. So these are the three major, so like theoretical perspectives, but there are a lot of other theories that are situated under them. So thinking about that and what your findings may be can be helpful to explain those. All right, so let's get into qualitative research now specifically. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly qualitative research is. So qualitative research is trying to understand social phenomena. It's trying to understand the lived experience. It is about deep, rich detail. We're trying to figure out perspectives, experiences, opinions. We're trying to figure out kind of what's going on with people and what's happening, how do they make sense of the world. We are not, and I this is something that you need to note. We are not making hypotheses. We do not make hypotheses in qualitative research. We are not predicting things based off of these. We are trying to explain and honor their experiences. We are not predicting, and in turn, we are not creating hypotheses. We can have some assumptions, we can have some ideas on what we think may happen, but we are not definitively coming up with a hypothesis. So I will say that one more time. We will not have a hypothesis in qualitative research. You should not, will not talk about having a hypothesis in qualitative research. Okay, so there's a lot of different types of qualitative research that exist. We have ethnographic or ethnography, narrative, phenomenological, grounded theory. That's not a theory, despite what it sounds like. It's more exploratory. So we have exploratory as well. Case studies, action research, and a lot of other different types. You have visual research, a bunch of different types. Now, I'm going to go into these, but I want to make note that you will only be working with narrative or case study for this class because you only can interview one person. We are only looking at narrative or case study. If you have a sound argument as to why it's a different one, it might be ethnography because of the cultural values or something that affect, but this is more larger scale. I'm telling you right now that you are likely going to be narrative or case study. But again, if you have a sound argument for something else, you need to make that make that argument. But you need to be able to differentiate between these for your proposal as for like your final paper, and you need to be able to differentiate these two, narrative and case study, for well, your methodology paper too. So let's go ahead and get into it. Ethnography is a word, is a type of design that folks seem to just kind of throw around all the time. However, it's not all qualitative research is ethnography. So first off, there's covert and overt ethnography, as well as active and passive. Covert is basically if you're going into like the quad at a high school and you're observing, but you're not telling people that you're being sneaky, right? You have something hidden and everything. That doesn't mean that you go up and say, hey, I'm observing you, but covert is hidden while overt is directly outside. And this can be useful because if you are trying to observe folks in like their quote unquote natural state, whatever that means, you might want a more covert approach without being like shady. But then at the same time, you might want to have an overt approach if you're being engaging and you're participating. And that's the difference between active and passive. So passive as well, like you can be overt and passive, or covert and passive, or covert and active. The tea room trade was an example of covert and active. So active is you're involved with the cultural norms that are going on and the cultural practices, while passive is you're not. You're literally just observing. The crucial aspect of ethnography is that it is deeply, you are immersed within the culture and the environment. The idea is that you're understanding cultural practices, cultural processes, cultural norms, societies, and the interworkings of them. You oftentimes, historically, ethnography has been participant observer. So you're participating with this cultural group while you're observing. You can also use ethnographic research through interviews and surveys, but oftentimes not. You're using it more with different artifacts. So it can be documents, it can be artwork, it's observations in the environment. And an example could be, let's say you want to figure out a classroom's cultural values and norms and how they make sense of a classroom. So it could be like a children's interaction on the playground. You're observing children. You're looking at, what language they use, how they interact, how do they cut each other in line, how do they share and negotiate. You could look at a teacher-student dynamic in a fifth grade. So you could look at how the teacher, supports an equitable culture in the classroom or a culture of dialogue. So these are all examples, right? The idea really is focusing on cultural norms and values, how people function and interact within those values. Now, the next one is narrative. Let me make very clear that a lot of these can overlap, though, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other, but you will normally lean toward one. So a research design is leaning toward one. There can be an overlap, but I would avoid having the overlap. So narrative is one that you're going to want to consider. Narrative is telling a story. It's generally focused on one small group, like very small group, or one or two people. So you're trying to piece together some sort of event or circumstance. This is done oftentimes through interviews. You can use documents. You can have artifacts that tell a story. You're looking basically at how people's lived experiences and are influenced. It doesn't have to be chronological, and you're storytelling. You're trying to take their lived experiences, their life story, and make sense of some sort of situation. So one example could be, let's say you are really good friends with the teacher and they really were burnt out during COVID-19 pedagogy and teaching. So maybe what you want to do is you want to interview two teachers, like your friend and their colleague from a school, and you want to think about, like, how did they survive? How did they foster a culture of community and camaraderie? And how do they come together? Or maybe there's a couple students who started a food justice club and really came together and made some sort of like major impact. What you're doing is you're telling the stories. The whole point is to document and capture the stories. You're creating a narrative around that, and you're doing it from a sociological perspective. The next one is phenomenological, and folks kind of get these ones all a little confused. So let me just kind of say that this right here is storytelling, right? One or two people storytelling. Phenomenological is where you're looking for a phenomenon, right? So some sort of phenomenon or situation that has happened. It's looking at the experiences of a group of people, so a larger group. So you're looking at how the phenomenon has impacted people, and how the kind of shared experiences can be made sense of. So you're exploring a specific phenomenon through these experiences. So everybody experienced COVID-19, right? So maybe the phenomenological approach is that you want to look at high school teachers' experiences during online teaching through COVID. The emphasis is not on their lived experiences in the same way that narrative would be. It's not even the same way as like a case study would be, which I'll get into. You want to look at the phenomenon of COVID, the phenomenon of teaching online through COVID. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to use these high school teachers' experiences to make sense of the practice of teaching online through COVID, the experience of teaching online through COVID. So the focus is not on the teachers, the focus is on the phenomenon of teaching through COVID, and you're just using these teachers' experiences as examples to make sense of that. That's phenomenological. Meanwhile, case studies are a little different. It is very deliberate. You're going out of your way to find one. So the other examples could be random, right? Yeah, you might have certain criteria or eligibility for people. So for instance, like here, you're going to want high school teachers specifically who taught through COVID, right? For this one, maybe you have a specific student because that's their story that you're telling. But what a case study is similar to that narrative in that You are seeing that there's one particular situation that's taking place, and they are your case study. They are one particular focus, and it's something that's complex. So you're looking at one particular situation. Unlike narrative, where you're trying to tell their story around a particular situation, a case study is where you're taking one particular situation and trying to use it to learn something and teach others from it. Narrative, you're basically documenting the story. Phenomenological, you're using a phenomenon to make sense. You're trying to make sense of a phenomenon using the stories. And then a case study is looking specifically at one particular situation and trying to take something and learn from it and then teach others from it. It can be an individual or a group of people. So let's say you have, let's say one teacher has like a solid and sound approach to fostering dialogue in the classroom. So then your case study is to look at that teacher. You're not capturing their storytelling of being a dialogical teacher, right? You're not looking at a phenomenon and interviewing multiple teachers. You say that teacher is damn good at what they do, teaching dialogue, and I want to capture that and use that and teach others how to do the same thing. That's what a case study is. A case study is taking one particular situation and now using that to teach others. So lastly, oops, lastly, in terms of research design, there's also action research. And action research or participatory action research is often used in K-12 and is a part of teacher education in other parts of the world, but is not included very often in institutions of higher education here in the United States for whatever reason. I mean, there are some programs that do, but as a collective. So action research is something that is used to identify a problem. It's called a problem of practice. It can be a whole institution, like a whole school. I used action research for one of my for a research study that I did back in 2021, and we were trying to figure out what basically we were doing well and what we were doing wrong with COVID teaching as an institution. Or it can be classroom oriented. So I could do an action research on like a particular class that I teach and what problems are there with my teaching or with the engagement. So the idea is to identify a problem of practice. And action research can overlap with a lot of these. It can be ethnographic, where you're looking at cultural values and norms of the institution, which is why you can use a combination of different artifacts, interviews, observations, analysis, documents, case studies. And the heart of action research is you identify that problem, and as a part of your data collection and analysis, you then identify a solution as the next step. Now, participatory action research is a little different. Action research is just like, as an educator, I go in and I start interviewing people and I'm like, all right, this is what I think needs to be the case. Or even if I ask them, I use that and then I don't involve them. Participatory action research is different in that participants are engaged in the research process with you. They're being central to the design, to the decisions, movement forward. Basically, they're an integral part of this kind of political involvement of research, which often has this top-down approach. My dissertation was participatory action research. It's guided and directed by the participants. You are a participant. You are a part of this collaborative team. Okay. So, for this idea, I really want to kind of think about how we can understand our research, even if we're not engaging in action research. So praxis is within this concept of critical pedagogy. This is a theory. This is a theoretical concept. Paulo Freire writes about it, and it's critical reflection and action. It stems from a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And basically the idea is that you have this theory, right? And action is like a movement forward to actually make the change. I just wanted to kind of touch upon this because when you're thinking about your research, one element for the discussion and kind of exploring of what to do is what's next, what's now, right? Um, and I just want to kind of bring this up because as you're thinking about education and educational transformation, that should be one of the crucial steps. Like theory is beautiful and wonderful. I'm an incredibly theoretical person, but it can't stop there. It can't just sit in theory, right? It can't just sit in literature. So thinking about that for your proposals, for instance, for like the second part of your methods paper, that's something that I want you to kind of conceptualize. It's like, what types of questions can I come up with that may align with that? Okay, so here's our last slide. And thinking about now your research questions. So you should start developing your research questions. One thing is think about your ontology. Um, what do you believe about the world? First off, remember again that this is education. Before I get to that, the second code word is horse. Horse. Okay. That's the second code word. Okay, so thinking about ontology, what do you believe about the world? And remember that this is education related. So, what do you want to learn and dig into from an educational transformation perspective? What do you think needs to be changed within education? So, think about that ontologically. What do you believe about the world? How do you ask questions that will come up with this? Now, for this week, I don't expect your research questions to be refined and formalized yet. That's something that you will be working on by next week, and there's some readings for that. I believe for next week to start thinking about this. Make sure your research question is qualitative, right? Start with the questions. What are you passionate about? And then again, like, why did you choose this class and not a different qualitative research class? So what are you passionate about it, right? Think about it as like a funnel, an upside down cone. Big picture, what are you passionate about? Narrow in now a topic like, oh, well, I'm really passionate about justice within socioeconomic status. I'm really passionate about, racial justice. I'm passionate about disability. I'm really passionate about all of these things. Think about that. How can you narrow in? Then you're going to go down and start kind of thinking about the questions. You don't have to have a refined question, but I really want you to start brainstorming now before it starts creeping up on you. Um, Try not to make them double barreled. So you're only going to have one research question, but if for some reason you need to have two, you would have them both together. So an example would be like, what are teachers' experience with COVID-19 and how did they find a sense of camaraderie? Right. So those are two different questions. Those two should be written as two separate questions. You want to have something that's narrowed enough to where you can actually answer that question in this research. Okay. Um, Look at some previous studies, look at some of the readings that I have posted. You can see what they have for their research questions. But think about what you want to learn that you haven't read a lot about, right? Or what have you learned that you would love to read more about? And those are some things to think about in terms of your research questions. So that's kind of all I have. I mean, that's a lot, I know, but that's what I have for you for this to kind of start thinking about moving forward and for you to kind of get prepared for, our quick movement forward. And you can do this, and we've got this.